On the outskirts of Manhattan, where luxury cars blur past forgotten streets, a broken-down Mercedes sits abandoned by the roadside. What seems like a chance encounter is actually an elaborate search for authenticity. For years, Katherine Morrison, a reclusive billionaire, has been testing the hearts of strangers, weary of a world where every smile comes with a price tag. But she never expected Michael Sullivan, a homeless man who still carries his old toolbox like a reminder of better days. Despite sleeping on park benches and scrounging for meals, his natural instinct isn't to ask for money, it's to help. This isn't just a story about a car repair. This is about how one act of selfless kindness would bridge two worlds and prove that sometimes the richest hearts beat beneath the poorest clothes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind whistled through Manhattan's concrete canyons, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Michael Sullivan pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his shoulders, his calloused hands clutching the worn leather handle of his toolbox, the last remnant of a life he'd lost 5 years ago. The morning sun hadn't yet reached the narrow streets, but he was already making his daily rounds, checking on the makeshift community that had become his unlikely family. "Morning, Mr. Fix-It," called Rosa, an elderly woman who'd been living under the Harrison Street Bridge for the past 3 years. She sat wrapped in the blanket Michael had found for her last week, her weathered face crinkling into a smile. "That heater you fixed is keeping these old bones warm." Michael nodded, managing a small smile despite the gnawing hunger in his stomach. "Just needs a little attention sometimes, that's all." He patted the toolbox at his side, the tools inside, rattling softly, each one maintained with the same meticulous care he'd shown when he owned his own shop. The memory of Sullivan's auto repair rose unbidden in his mind. The gleaming equipment, the satisfied customers, the respect he'd earned through 20 years of honest work. Then came the accident, the medical bills, the insurance company's denial, and finally the bankruptcy that had stripped him of everything except his dignity and his tools. "You ever gonna tell me what's in that magic box of yours?" Rosa asked. Interrupting his thoughts, Michael knelt beside her, the concrete cold through his worn jeans. He opened the toolbox, revealing the pristine tools nestled in their worn compartments, each one polished and arranged with military precision. "These aren't just tools, Rosa. They're stories. This wrench helped me rebuild my first engine when I was 16. This diagnostic meter, latest model when I bought it, saved enough customers' cars to pay for itself in a month." A group of suited professionals hurried past, their eyes carefully avoiding the scene of the homeless man and his prized possession. Michael was used to being invisible. It was a skill he'd perfected over the years, but his hands still itched to work, to fix, to make things right again. He made his way through the morning crowd, stopping to check on others in his informal network. There was Dave, a veteran whose wheelchair needed regular maintenance. Sarah, a young runaway whose portable radio provided their only connection to the outside world, and old Tom, whose shopping cart's wheels Michael had reinforced last month. Each interaction reinforced the code he lived by: help where you can, keep your dignity intact, and never let circumstances steal your humanity. The tools in his box weren't just instruments of repair, they were his connection to who he'd been, who he still was beneath the layers of misfortune. Near noon, he stopped at St. Mary's Soup Kitchen, where Sister Margaret always saved him a bowl of whatever was on offer. "You're looking thin, Michael," she said, sliding him an extra piece of bread. "Still won't consider the shelter program?" He shook his head, words unnecessary between them. The shelters meant leaving his toolbox behind, and that was the one thing he wouldn't do. Instead, he ate quietly, watching the others around him, the newly homeless still shocked by their circumstances, the long-timers with their vacant stares, and the fighters like himself who refused to let their situation define them. After lunch, he made his way toward his usual spot near the financial district, where the contrast between his current life and the gleaming towers of success was most stark. He'd learned to find shelter in the shadowed alcoves between buildings, places where the wind couldn't reach and security guards were less likely to roust him. The city moved around him in its endless dance of prosperity and poverty, of success and failure, of happiness and despair. But Michael had learned to see beyond these superficial divisions. In his experience, a millionaire's Ferrari could break down just as surely as a teacher's Toyota, and both needed the same honest attention to run properly again. His fingers traced the edges of his certification papers, carefully preserved in a waterproof sleeve at the bottom of his toolbox. Master Mechanic, ASE certified, top of his class, credentials that had once opened doors but now served only as reminders of what he'd lost. Yet he couldn't bring himself to sell them, just as he couldn't sell his tools. They were more than possessions. They were proof that Michael Sullivan was more than what the world saw when they looked at a homeless man on the street. The afternoon light was fading when Michael first spotted the Mercedes. It sat alone on a quiet side street, its silver paint catching the last rays of sun like liquid mercury. A 1960 300 SL Roadster, the kind of car that belonged in a museum, not abandoned on a Manhattan street corner. His mechanic's instincts tingled, decades of experience telling him something wasn't right. He hesitated, clutching his toolbox tighter. Cars like this didn't just break down, and their owners didn't just walk away. In his former life, he'd worked on vehicles worth millions, understanding that each scratch could cost thousands to repair. The liability alone had required special insurance. But there was something about the way the engine had died. He could hear the slight clicking of cooling metal, indicating a recent shutdown. Moving closer, his trained eye caught subtle signs of distress. The way the engine had cut out, the slight ambient temperature difference around the fuel injection system. "You're a beauty, aren't you?" he murmured, setting his toolbox down carefully. The familiar weight of expertise settled over him as he assessed the situation. The problem was obvious to his experienced eye, a deliberately induced malfunction in the fuel injection system, the kind that would strand the car without causing permanent damage. A high-pitched laugh from somewhere nearby made him jump. Looking around, he saw only shadows between buildings, but the prickle on the back of his neck told him he wasn't alone. He should walk away. This wasn't his problem. These days, trying to help often led to accusations of tampering or theft. But his hands were already opening his toolbox, muscle memory taking over as he selected the appropriate tools. The diagnostic meter he'd maintained so carefully over the years would tell him exactly what he needed to know. As he connected it to the car's system, readings confirmed his suspicions. "Simple enough to fix," he muttered to himself. The familiar dialogue of a mechanic with a vehicle filling the growing darkness. Just need to reset the injection timing and clear the sensor fault. His movements were precise, efficient, born of thousands of similar repairs. The tools felt right in his hands, each one an old friend helping him restore order to chaos. He worked by touch as much as sight, his fingers remembering paths they'd traced countless times before. Time slipped away as he worked, the street growing quieter around him. A few passers-by gave him curious looks. A homeless man working on a luxury car was bound to raise eyebrows, but something in his focused demeanor kept them from interfering. The repair itself was straightforward for someone with his expertise. The real challenge was doing it without modern shop equipment, relying instead on the hand tools he'd preserved so carefully. Yet there was satisfaction in this, proving that skill mattered more than fancy machinery. As he worked, memories surfaced of similar repairs in his shop, the smell of coffee from his waiting room, the radio playing classic rock, customers trusting him with their prized possessions. He'd never betrayed that trust, had built his reputation on honesty and expertise. Even now, homeless and hungry, those principles guided his hands. "There you go," he said softly, disconnecting his diagnostic meter. He'd done more than fix the immediate problem. He'd checked the entire fuel system, adjusted the timing for optimal performance, even cleaned the sensors while he was in there. Old habits died hard. Standing back, he admired the car one last time. In another life, he'd be leaving an invoice for several $100s, explaining the repairs to an appreciative owner. Now he'd simply pack his tools and disappear back into the shadows of the city. No one needed to know who had fixed the car or why. But as he gathered his tools, that prickle returned to the back of his neck. Someone was watching, had been watching the entire time. The thought should have frightened him, but instead it brought a strange sense of peace. He'd done what needed doing, helped because he could. Whatever came next, he'd stayed true to who he was. The streetlights flickered to life as Michael methodically cleaned each tool before returning it to his box. The routine was so ingrained he could have done it blindfolded, a habit drilled into him decades ago by his first mentor, old Jack Henderson, at the Community College Automotive Program. "Tools are your livelihood, boy," Jack's voice echoed in his memory. "Treat them right. They'll never let you down." Michael had been just 19 then, eager to prove himself in the certification program. Now, at 49, those words had become a mantra, a thread of consistency in a life unraveled by circumstance. A small crowd of homeless people had gathered at a safe distance, drawn by the unusual sight. Among them was Dave, wheeling himself closer with cautious interest. "You sure about this, Michael?" Dave's military background made him naturally protective of their small community. "That's the kind of car that comes with complicated problems, and I don't mean mechanical ones." Michael wiped his hands on a clean rag from his toolbox. "Everything about this is complicated, Dave, but the repair itself?" He shook his head, a ghost of professional pride crossing his weathered features. "That's textbook fuel injection maintenance. Did my master certification thesis on this exact system?" The memory surfaced clearly. 3 days of practical exams, his hands steady as he diagnosed and repaired increasingly complex problems. He'd scored in the top percentile nationally, earning special recognition from the certification board. The framed certificate, now carefully preserved in his toolbox, had hung prominently in his shop's front office. His diagnostic meter beeped, confirming the successful repair. The sound drew him back to another time, another repair job. His first solo restoration of a classic Mercedes, back when he was building his reputation. The owner had been skeptical, unwilling to trust such an expensive car to a relatively young mechanic. But Michael's attention to detail had won him over, leading to a string of high-end clients. The S-Class had unique fuel injection challenges, he explained to Dave, falling naturally into the teaching role he'd once enjoyed with his apprentices. They introduced this system in the late 50s, revolutionary for its time. "The problem most mechanics make is treating it like a modern setup." He walked around the car, checking everything one final time. His hands moved with the certainty of decades of experience, each touch both diagnostic and respectful. The gathering crowd watched in silence, recognizing the grace of a master at work. Sarah, the young runaway, edged closer. "How'd you learn all this, Michael?" The question transported him back to his own apprenticeship. "Started in high school, actually. Shop class." He smiled at the memory. "Teacher noticed I had a knack for understanding how things worked. Got me into the vocational program. Then, community college." His fingers traced the Mercedes hood ornament as he spoke. "Spent 5 years getting my certifications. Worked my way up from oil changes to engine rebuilds. Learned every system, every quirk." Pride crept into his voice despite his circumstances. "By the time I opened my own shop, I could diagnose most problems just by listening to the engine." The sound of expensive heels clicking on pavement interrupted his reminiscence. The crowd melted away into the shadows, leaving Michael alone with his toolbox and the repaired Mercedes. He knew without looking that the car's owner had arrived. Could feel the weight of observation that had been present throughout the repair. His hand instinctively went to his certification papers, tucked safely in their waterproof sleeve. They were creased now, worn from years of careful folding and unfolding, but the gold seal still caught the streetlight. Master Mechanic, ASE certified, a specialist in European luxury vehicles, titles that had once defined his professional life. The clicking heels stopped. Michael straightened up, his dignity settling around him like a familiar coat. He might be homeless, but his expertise was undiminished, his work as precise and professional as it had been in his own shop. Whatever came next, he'd done the job right. Not for reward or recognition, but because that's what a true mechanic does. Old Jack's voice whispered one last time in his memory. It's not about the money, kid. It's about doing right by the machine and its owner. You do that, you'll never go wrong. Michael closed his toolbox with a quiet click. He'd done right by both. The woman who emerged from the shadows wasn't what Michael expected. No designer suit, no obvious displays of wealth, just a simple grey dress and practical heels, though both were clearly well made. Her dark hair was pulled back in an understated bun, her face free of makeup. Something about her deliberate plainness felt calculated, like a costume chosen for a specific role. "You fix my car," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to being heard. Michael nodded, keeping his posture straight despite his worn clothes. Fuel injection system needed adjustment. Sensors were throwing false readings. He paused, then added with professional certainty, "It won't give you any more trouble." Katherine Morrison studied him with eyes that missed nothing, taking in his threadbare jacket, the dignity in his stance, and most importantly, the way he'd treated her car. She'd watched the entire repair from the window of a nearby building, noting his methodical approach and the obvious expertise in every movement. "Most people would have called a tow truck," she said, moving closer, "or simply walked past. Most people haven't spent 30 years working on these engines." The words came out before he could stop them, pride temporarily overwhelming caution. A slight smile touched her lips. "No, they haven't." She gestured to his toolbox. "May I?" Michael hesitated. His tools were his most precious possession, his last connection to his former life. But something in her expression, a genuine respect for craftsmanship perhaps, made him nod. She opened the lid carefully, and her practiced eye took in the immaculate organization, the quality of each tool, the way every piece was maintained. Despite obvious age and use, her fingers brushed the protective sleeve containing his certifications, but she didn't remove them, respecting the privacy of personal documents. "These tools have history," she observed, closing the box with the same care she'd opened it. "Yes, ma'am." "Katherine," she corrected, then added, "and you are Michael Sullivan." He didn't offer his former title or credentials. Those belonged to a different life. She nodded as if confirming something to herself. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, I believe I owe you for the repair." Michael shook his head. "No charge. The work needed doing, so I did it." "Everything has a price," she countered, but there was something curious in her tone, as if his response had surprised her. "Not everything." He reached for his toolbox, ready to disappear back into the anonymity of the streets. "Car's ready, whenever you need it. Just—" He hesitated, then continued. "Just make sure to have the timing checked every 5,000 miles. These older fuel injection systems need regular attention." Katherine's hand moved toward her purse, but something stopped her. Instead, she asked, "When was the last time you had a proper meal, Mr. Sullivan?" The question caught him off guard. His instinct was to deflect, to maintain the professional distance he'd cultivated, but his stomach chose that moment to remind him that Sister Margaret's soup had been many hours ago. "I don't need charity," he said firmly. "No," she agreed, surprising him again. "You don't. But I do need dinner, and I prefer not to eat alone. Consider it a consultation fee. I have questions about the car's maintenance schedule." Michael recognized the fiction for what it was, a way to preserve his dignity while offering help. He looked at her more carefully, seeing past the deliberately plain clothes to something else. A loneliness that matched his own, perhaps, or an understanding of what it meant to maintain pride in difficult circumstances. "There's a diner around the corner," he said finally. "Good coffee." Catherine's smile widened slightly, becoming more genuine. "Lead the way, Mr. Sullivan." As they walked, Michael noticed how she matched his pace, neither hurrying ahead nor falling behind. She kept a natural distance, respecting his space while maintaining conversation about the Mercedes engineering. Her knowledge of the car's history was impressive. Another calculated detail, he suspected, though he couldn't yet guess why. The night had grown colder, the wind picking up between the buildings. Katherine showed no reaction to the chill, but Michael noticed how she angled herself slightly, shielding him from the worst of the wind without making it obvious. It was a small gesture, easy to miss, but it suggested she was more observant and perhaps more compassionate than her carefully controlled demeanor suggested. They reached the diner just as the first drops of rain began to fall, the neon sign casting multicolored reflections on the wet sidewalk. Through the window, Michael could see the usual late-night crowd, taxi drivers, hospital workers, people whose lives happened while the rest of the city slept. Normal people living normal lives. For the first time in years, he was about to join them, even if just for a meal. Katherine reached for the door, then paused. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for fixing my car." But something in her voice suggested she was thanking him for more than just the repair, for proving, perhaps, that her test of human nature hadn't been in vain. The fluorescent lights of Jerry's all-night diner cast a harsh reality over both of them. Under the unforgiving glare, the quality of Katherine's simple dress became more apparent, as did the careful maintenance of Michael's worn clothing. They slid into a booth near the back, where a cracked coffee mug sat upturned on a faded formica table. The night waitress, Doris, approached with a coffee pot, hesitating only slightly at the odd pair. She'd worked these shifts long enough to know better than to ask questions. "2 coffees?" "Please," Katherine said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority it had on the street. "And menus, if you would." Michael watched as his companion settled into the vinyl booth with surprising ease, as if she frequently found herself in all-night diners with homeless mechanics. There was a story there, he was certain, but pride kept him from asking. Instead, he focused on the coffee Doris poured, its warmth seeping through the cracked mug into his cold hands. "You know," Katherine said, studying her own cup, "that Mercedes was my father's. He bought it the year I was born." Michael nodded, professional interest momentarily overriding his reticence. 1960 model. They only made about 1,858 of the 300 SL Roadsters. Fuel-injected, straight-six engine. First of its kind. "You know your classics," she smiled, but there was something hesitant in it. "Dad used to say you could judge a person's character by how they treat a fine machine." "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. The past tense hung between them. Katherine absently turned her coffee cup, revealing a chip in its rim that matched her sudden vulnerability. "He died 5 years ago, left me everything, the company, the responsibilities, the legacy." Michael absorbed this information silently, understanding now why she'd been watching him work on the car. Some things were worth more than their monetary value. Doris returned with menus, but Katherine gently waved them away. "The usual 4. Both of us, Doris, if you would." The waitress nodded and disappeared, leaving Michael to raise an eyebrow. "You come here often enough to have a usual?" "Everyone needs a place where they're just another customer." Katherine's eyes met his, sharing a moment of unexpected understanding. "Sometimes being anonymous is the greatest luxury of all." The truth of that statement resonated with Michael. How many times had he wished to be seen as just another mechanic again, rather than the homeless man who carried a toolbox? Their Food arrived, classic hamburgers, crispy fries, and small side salads that had clearly been added to the diner's menu in a nod to modern health consciousness. Simple food, but made with care. "Tell me about the repair," Katherine said, arranging her napkin. "Pretend I know enough about cars to follow along." Michael found himself explaining the intricacies of the fuel injection system, his natural teaching instincts emerging as Katherine asked intelligent questions. She listened with genuine interest, her questions revealing a deeper technical knowledge than she initially let on. "You're familiar with engines," he observed during a pause. "Dad insisted I learn the basics before he'd let me drive the Mercedes." A fond smile touched her lips. "Said if I was going to run his company someday, I needed to understand how things worked from the ground up." The conversation flowed naturally from there, touching on engineering, the changing face of Manhattan, the craftsmanship of earlier eras. They avoided personal topics by unspoken agreement, dealing instead in safer subjects: the proper maintenance of classic cars, the importance of quality tools, the satisfaction of solving mechanical problems. Yet beneath their careful conversation, Michael sensed layers of unasked questions. Why was a woman who clearly came from wealth eating at a diner in the middle of the night? Why had she really been testing strangers with her father's car? For her part, Katherine seemed to be studying him with equal curiosity, noting the precision with which he ate, the careful way he handled the cracked coffee mug, the dignity that no amount of hardship had erased. As they finished their meal, the rain outside intensified, drumming against the diner's windows. The sound created a cocoon of privacy around their booth, a temporary shelter from the realities waiting outside. "Your father would have appreciated the work you did tonight," Katherine said finally, breaking a comfortable silence. "The care you took, the expertise you showed." The car deserved nothing less. Michael wiped his hands carefully on his napkin, maintaining the standards he'd always lived by, even here. "No," Katherine agreed softly, "it didn't." She reached for her purse, then stopped at Michael's expression. "At least, let me cover the meal." He shook his head. "Split it, please." It wasn't just pride speaking. It was the need to maintain the fragile equality of their conversation, to remain someone who had fixed her car rather than someone she had helped. Understanding flickered in her eyes. She nodded, placing exactly half the bill's amount on the table, plus a generous tip for Doris. As they prepared to leave, she paused, seeming to wrestle with a decision. "Mr. Sullivan," she said carefully, "I may have another car that needs your expertise. Would you be interested in a more formal consultation?" Michael stood beneath the diner's neon sign, rain misting around them as he processed Katherine's words. A formal consultation. The phrase carried weight, implications he wasn't sure he was ready to face. "I have a small collection of classic cars," Katherine continued, her voice measured. "They belong to my father. Since his passing, they haven't received the attention they deserve." She reached into her purse and withdrew a business card, holding it out between two fingers. The card was simple but elegant. Morrison Technologies. It read, with an address in Midtown Manhattan. Below that was a direct phone number and email address. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind his old shop would have used for special clients. "I'm offering you a job, Mr. Sullivan, as my personal mechanical consultant." Michael's fingers tightened around his toolbox handle. "Ms. Morrison, Katherine, please." "Katherine," he amended, "I appreciate the offer, but before you—" "Decline," she interrupted gently. "Let me be clear about what I'm proposing." She gestured to a covered entrance nearby, seeking shelter from the increasing rain. Once they were both out of the weather, she continued, "The position would include access to a fully equipped workshop, complete creative control over restoration projects, and accommodation if you want it." Michael's heart beat faster at the mention of a workshop, but caution tempered his response. "Why me?" Because you spent 2 hours repairing a car in the dark, using hand tools with the same precision I'd expect from a top-tier restoration specialist, because you refused payment for work that would have cost thousands at a professional shop. And because, she paused, choosing her words carefully, my father always said that true expertise can't be faked. It shows in every action, every decision, regardless of circumstances. The rain drummed steadily around them now, creating a private space in the night. Michael studied the business card, its edges sharp and clean against his weathered hands. What exactly would this position entail? Initial focus would be on the restoration and maintenance of my father's collection. 6 vehicles, all classics, all requiring varying degrees of attention. Beyond that, I'd want your input on acquiring new pieces, evaluating potential purchases, perhaps eventually developing a proper automotive division within the company. It was more than a job offer. It was a chance at rebuilding his life. Yet something held him back. Your board of directors wouldn't object to hiring a master mechanic with over 30 years of experience. Catherine's voice was firm. No, they wouldn't. Your qualifications speak for themselves, Mr. Sullivan. I don't care about your current circumstances. I care about your expertise and integrity. Michael's mind raced with possibilities. A workshop, tools, the chance to work on classic cars again, but also the weight of responsibility, of returning to the world he'd lost. I'd need time to consider it. Katherine nodded, unsurprised. Of course. She gestured to the business card. That number connects directly to my private line. When you're ready to discuss details, call me. She paused, then added, and Mr. Sullivan, the offer has no expiration. A date. Take the time you need. She turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. The position includes a signing bonus, enough to buy new clothes, handle any immediate needs. Not charity, she added quickly, seeing his expression. Standard corporate policy for executive-level consultants. Michael watched her walk away, her figure gradually disappearing into the rain. The business card felt heavy in his hand, laden with possibility and risk. He looked down at his toolbox, the faithful companion of his darkest years, then back at the card. Dave's wheelchair would need its monthly maintenance tomorrow. Sarah's radio was acting up again. Old Tom's cart had a squeaky wheel. He had responsibilities. Here people who counted on him. But as he walked through the rain toward his usual sleeping spot, Michael found himself thinking about engines, about the satisfaction of bringing old machines back to life, about a workshop of his own again. When he finally settled into his sheltered corner, he carefully placed the business card in the waterproof sleeve with his certifications. He didn't need to decide tonight. Katherine had given him time, understanding that some choices needed to breathe. Still, as he drifted off to sleep, the image of that workshop lingered in his mind. Not just tools and machines, but a chance to reclaim the pride that had never truly left him. A chance to be Michael Sullivan, master mechanic, once again. 3 days later, Michael stood before the Morrison Technologies building, its glass and steel facade reaching toward the morning sky. He wore new clothes, simple but professional attire, purchased with part of the signing bonus Katherine had insisted on providing in advance. His toolbox, freshly cleaned but still bearing its years of honest wear, remained his most prominent accessory. The security guard at the desk looked up as he approached, eyes noting the toolbox with professional suspicion. "Can I help you?" "Michael Sullivan. I have an appointment with Katherine Morrison." The guard's demeanor shifted subtly as he checked his computer. "Yes, Mr. Sullivan, Ms. Morrison left specific instructions. Frank will escort you to the private elevator." Frank turned out to be a young security officer who maintained a carefully neutral expression as they rode up to the executive floor. The elevator opened directly into a space that took Michael's breath away, not for its luxury, though that was evident, but for what occupied most of it. A pristine 1957 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing stood in the center of what had once been An executive suite, its silver paint reflecting the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Around it, the office had been transformed into a high-tech workshop, with modern diagnostic equipment sharing space with vintage tools. "Welcome to your new workspace," Katherine said, emerging from a side office. She wore a tailored business suit today, but her smile held the same genuine warmth from the diner. "What do you think?" Michael moved toward the gull wing, his trained eye already cataloguing its condition. "She's beautiful. Original paint?" "Yes. Dad insisted on preservation over restoration whenever possible." Katherine watched as he circled the car with reverent precision. "This floor used to be our main conference room. I had it converted over the weekend." The implications of that casual statement, the expense, the authority required to make such a dramatic change, highlighted the vast difference in their worlds. Yet here was a workshop that any mechanic would envy, and a car that deserved exactly the kind of expertise he possessed. "The rest of the collection is in a secure facility outside the city," Katherine continued. "But I thought having one project here would give you a chance to acclimate." A discreet cough interrupted them. A man in an expensive suit stood by the elevator, his expression suggesting he'd bitten into something sour. "Ms. Morrison, the board is waiting." "Thank you, James. I'll be there shortly." She turned back to Michael. "That's James Preston, our CFO. You'll meet the rest of the executive team later. For now, take some time to familiarize yourself with the space. Everything here is at your disposal." After she left, Michael explored his new domain. The tools were top of the line, the diagnostic equipment state-of-the-art, but it was the small details that revealed Katherine's thoughtfulness. A vintage radio restored to working condition, a comfortable mechanic's creeper, a professional coffee maker in the corner. Throughout the morning, he could sense curious eyes watching through the glass walls. Office workers found excuses to pass by, stealing glances at both the car and its unusual new caretaker. Their whispers weren't quite quiet enough to escape his hearing. "That's him, the homeless mechanic. Did you hear? She found him on the street. Must have some talent to land a position like this. Or some secret. Nobody gets hired at this level without connections." Michael focused on his initial inspection of the gull wing, letting the gossip wash over him. The car's engine spoke a language he understood perfectly, its needs clear and honest. Here, in this strange new world of corporate politics and glass walls, that clarity was comforting. Around noon, Katherine returned. She carried 2 paper bags that bore the logo of a familiar diner. "I thought you might prefer lunch from Jerry's," she said, setting them on a clean workbench. "How's our patient?" "Timing slightly off, and the fuel lines could use attention." He wiped his hands carefully before accepting the bag. "But she's remarkably well preserved." They ate in comfortable silence, the gull wing keeping watch over them like a silver guardian. Through the windows, Michael could see office workers trying not to stare at this unusual scene. Their CEO sharing diner food with a mechanic, sitting on shop stools as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "They'll get used to it," Katherine said, following his gaze to the curious onlookers. "In time, they'll judge you by your work, not your past." Michael nodded, understanding that this was just the beginning of his challenges. He had to prove himself, not just as a mechanic, but as someone worthy of the trust Katherine had placed in him. The whispers would continue, the speculation would grow, but as long as he had machines to repair and problems to solve, he could face whatever came next. He caught his reflection in the gull wing's polished surface, new clothes, straight posture, tools at hand. For the first time in years, he looked like himself again, not just a man who fixed things, but a master of his craft, ready to rebuild more than just engines. The gullwing's engine purred to life, its sound echoing through the transformed executive floor. After 2 weeks of meticulous work, Michael had brought the classic car back to its original glory. He sat in the driver's seat, hands resting lightly on the wheel, listening for any irregularities in the idle. Through the glass walls, he noticed a group of executives huddled near the water cooler, their attention divided between their smartphones and his workshop. One of them held up a tablet, showing something to the others that caused a burst of poorly concealed laughter. "Ignore them!" Catherine's voice came from behind him. She wore a dark blue suit today, her CEO persona firmly in place, but her eyes held a hint of concern. "They're reading that ridiculous article in the Financial Times." Michael stepped out of the car, wiping his hands on a clean shop rag. "Article?" She handed him her phone. The headline read, "Morrison Technologies CEOs. Unusual hire raises eyebrows. Charity or something more." Below it was a grainy photo of them leaving Jerry's diner, taken the night they first met. "They've been trying to contact me for comment," Katherine said, taking back the phone. "Speculation about why I would hire someone without a fixed address or recent employment history. The more respectable publications are focusing on the corporate angle, but the tabloids—" She trailed off, her expression darkening. Michael's jaw tightened. He'd known this job would come with scrutiny, but seeing their private interactions splashed across the media made it real in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Maybe I should—" "Don't you dare suggest leaving," Katherine interrupted. "Your work speaks for itself. The Gullwing hasn't run this well since my father owned it." As if to prove her point, the engine's steady purr filled the silence between them. But the damage was done. Michael could feel more eyes on them now, corporate vultures watching for any sign of impropriety. A sharp knock on the glass drew their attention. James Preston, the CFO, stood there with several board members. Their expressions suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "The board has concerns," Katherine said quietly, "about public perception, stock prices, the usual corporate nonsense." She straightened her jacket, CEO mask firmly in place. "I'll handle it." Michael watched her stride into the conference room, her authority evident in every step. Through the glass, he could see the heated discussion unfold. Katherine stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on its polished surface, her position both literal and figurative as she defended her decisions. He turned back to the Gullwing, losing himself in the familiar routine of final adjustments. The car didn't care about his past or the gossip surrounding his present. It responded to skill, to understanding, to the expertise earned through decades of dedication. Later that afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the workshop floor, Katherine returned. She looked tired but satisfied. "The board has been reminded that under my leadership, company stock has risen 40%. They've agreed to issue a statement supporting my hiring decisions and emphasizing our commitment to second chances and recognizing talent in unexpected places." Michael nodded, relief mixing with something else. Pride, perhaps, in Katherine's defense of him, or determination to prove her faith warranted. "I found something you should see," he said, leading her to the Gullwing's engine bay. There, carved discreetly into the engine block, was a set of initials, RM, "your father's mark," he explained. "He must have worked on this engine himself. You can tell by the tool patterns, classic techniques that aren't used much anymore." Katherine traced the initials with her finger, her corporate armor cracking slightly. "He never told me he did his own work on them." "A man who understands engines understands the value of doing things right," Michael said softly, "no matter what anyone else thinks." She looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing past the new clothes to the dedication that had survived years of hardship. "The press can write what they want," she said firmly. "I know I made the right choice." As if to punctuate her statement, the elevator dinged, and a mail clerk entered with a large envelope. "Special delivery for Mr. Sullivan," he announced, trying not to stare. Inside was a copy of Automotive Excellence magazine with a post-it note attached. "Thought you'd want to see this. K." The article was titled Morrison Technologies Pioneers Second Chance Employment Program and featured a professional photo of the workshop, the Gullwing gleaming under perfect lighting. The piece was respectful, focusing on Michael's expertise and the innovative nature of Katherine's hiring practices. It quoted industry experts praising the quality of work, evident in the classic car collection, and even included a subtle reference to his past without sensationalism. Michael looked up to find Katherine watching him, a small smile playing at her lips. "Sometimes," she said, "the best response to gossip is simply to do good work." He nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. They were in this together now. Reputation and redemption intertwined in ways neither had expected. The whispers might continue, but they would face them with the same precision and care they brought to restoring these classic machines, one careful adjustment at a time. The truth arrived in the form of Forbes magazine's annual Billionaire list. Michael found the copy in the workshop's waiting area, placed there innocuously among other business publications. He might have missed it entirely if the cleaning staff hadn't knocked it off the table, opening it to the featured profile. There she was, Katherine Morrison, photographed in front of Morrison Technologies headquarters. The headline read, "The Reclusive Rising Star, How Katherine Morrison Turned Her Father's Legacy into a $50 billion Empire." Michael sat heavily on his workbench, the magazine trembling slightly in his hands. He'd known she was wealthy, of course. The building, the cars, the corporate power, all had spoken of significant means. But this was different. This wasn't just wealth. This was world-changing, nation-influencing money. The article painted a picture he hadn't known. Katherine Morrison, the tech industry's most enigmatic leader, known for her innovative approach to corporate leadership and her obsession with authenticity. It mentioned her habit of testing potential executives through elaborate scenarios, her distrust of traditional hiring practices, her belief that true character revealed itself in unguarded moments. Everything clicked into place. The deliberately disabled Mercedes, the plain dress, the careful observation of his repair work. He hadn't been a chance encounter. He'd been an experiment. The door opened, and Katherine walked in, dressed today, in a simple black suit. She stopped when she saw the magazine in his hands, her expression shifting from surprise to resignation. "You were never going to tell me, were you?" Michael's voice was quiet, controlled. "About the tests, about the other candidates before me." Katherine moved closer, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "Would it have changed anything if you'd known?" "That's not the point." He stood, kneading the familiar feel of tools in his hands. He began organizing his workbench, a habit that had always helped him think. "You watched me that night, evaluated me like a specimen under a microscope. I watched you demonstrate expertise, integrity, and kindness without any expectation of reward," Katherine corrected. "Do you know how rare that is in my world? How many people I've seen reveal their true nature when they thought no one was looking?" She reached for a file folder on her desk, pulling out a stack of papers. "These are the records of my previous tests, dozens of candidates, all presented, with similar opportunities to help. Most ignored the situation entirely. Some called for assistance, but wouldn't get involved personally. A few tried to help, but demanded immediate compensation." Michael leafed through the documents, seeing photographs, notes, detailed observations. "This is how you hire all your executives. The important ones." Katherine's voice softened. "The ones who need to be more than just competent. They need to be genuine. And what happens to the ones who fail? Nothing. They go about their lives never knowing they were tested. But the ones who pass," she gestured to the workshop around them, "they get a chance to do what they love, to be valued for who they really are." Michael set down the papers, turning to face her fully. "I understand why you did it. But you've had weeks to tell me the truth. Instead, I had to find out from a magazine. Because the moment people learn who I really am, everything changes." Frustration crept into her voice. "Every word becomes calculated, every action measured against my wealth." For a few weeks, I got to be just Katherine, talking about cars, with someone who saw me as a person, not a net worth figure. The silence stretched between them, filled with the soft ticking of cooling engines and the distant hum of office life. Beyond the glass walls, Michael looked at the gull wing, its silver surface reflecting their standoff. "The first car I ever worked on," he said finally, "was a '67 Mustang. Owner brought it in after 3 other shops had failed to fix the transmission. I spent 2 days on it, sleeping under the car, because I'd given my word I'd make it right. Not for the money, not for the reputation, but because that's what the car deserved." He turned back to Katherine. "I am who I am, whether I'm working on a billionaire's Mercedes or a teacher's Toyota. That hasn't changed since the day I lost everything, and it won't change now that I know who you really are." Katherine's shoulders relaxed slightly, relief crossing her features. "That's exactly why I hired you." "Next time," Michael said, picking up a wrench and moving toward the waiting Ferrari that had arrived that morning, "just be honest with me. I've spent enough years stripped of everything except my integrity. I need to know I can trust the people in my life now." Katherine nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "No more tests," she promised. "From now on, just truth." "Good." He popped the Ferrari's hood. "Because this timing belt needs replacing, and I'd rather focus on fixing cars than wondering what else I don't know about my employer." A small smile touched Katherine's lips. "Partner," she corrected. "After what you've proven, you've earned that much." Michael's hands stilled on the engine. "Partner." The word carried weight, responsibility, respect. He nodded once, accepting both the title and the trust it represented. Then he turned back to the Ferrari, letting the familiar work heal the morning's revelations. The crisis struck on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Michael was deep in the engine bay of a rare Aston Martin when he heard the commotion. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, the unmistakable tension of corporate panic seeping through the workshops. Glass walls. James Preston burst in without knocking, his usual composure shattered. "Where's Katherine? The server farm is down, all of it." Michael straightened, wiping his hands. "Board meeting, 20th floor." The whole system's crashed. Preston continued, more to himself than Michael. 5 data centers, simultaneous failure. We're looking at millions in losses every hour. The elevator dinged, and Katherine strode out, phone pressed to her ear. "No, that's not acceptable. We need those servers back online now." She ended the call, her face tight with controlled stress. "Status?" Preston launched into a technical explanation that made Michael's head spin. Cooling system failures, cascading shutdowns, backup systems offline. But beneath the jargon, his mechanic's ear caught something familiar. "What kind of cooling system?" he interrupted. Both Katherine and Preston turned to him, surprised. "Industrial grade," Preston said dismissively. "State of the art." "But what kind?" Michael pressed. "The physical mechanism, how does it work?" Katherine's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "It's a hybrid system, liquid cooling primary with air backup." "Why?" Michael was already moving to his toolbox. "Your tech team's looking at it like a computer problem. But at its heart, it's just a complex engine cooling system." He pulled out his diagnostic tablet, a gift from Katherine he'd initially resisted accepting. "Show me." 20 minutes later, they stood in the heart of Morrison Technology's main data center. The room was enormous, filled with rows of servers that now sat silent. The air was hot, heavy with the scent of overheated electronics. Michael moved through the space like he would a garage, his trained eye taking in details others might miss. He stopped at a junction box, running his hand along a thick pipe. "Here, feel this." Katherine pressed her palm against the pipe, then pulled back sharply. "It's vibrating. Microfractures in the primary cooling loop," Michael explained, "causing resonance through the whole system. Your sensors read it as normal operation because the vibration pattern matches expected flow rates, but it's actually damaging the entire network, creating microscopic leaks." Preston looked skeptical. "That's impossible." "These systems have redundancies, which all feed through the same damage section," Michael finished, "like running multiple fuel lines through a single corrupted filter. One bad point takes down the whole engine." Katherine's phone buzzed with another crisis update, but she ignored it. "Can you fix it?" Michael was already opening his toolbox. "I'll need help and parts, specific parts." "Whatever you need." For the next 6 hours, Michael directed a team of technicians like he once ran his garage. They bypassed the damaged section, rerouted cooling lines, and fabricated custom connectors using techniques he'd perfected on high-performance engines. "This is temporary," he explained as they worked. "The whole system needs an overhaul, but this will get you running again." Katherine stayed through it all, her suit jacket discarded, helping where she could, making calls when needed. She watched Michael work with the same intensity she'd shown that first night with the Mercedes, seeing not just what he did, but who he was while doing it. "Server farms responding," a technician called out, temperature dropping to normal levels. One by one, the servers hummed back to life. Preston stared at his tablet in disbelief as systems came online. "It's working! My God, it's actually working!" Michael closed his toolbox, exhausted but satisfied. The familiar ache in his hands reminded him of long nights in his old shop, solving problems others had missed. "You'll want to schedule complete replacement of the cooling system. I can draw up specifications, show you what to look for." Katherine nodded, but her attention was on him, not the recovering servers. "You just saved this company millions of dollars." "I just fixed a broken machine," he corrected. "Same as I've always done." She smiled, understanding. "Come on, I think we both need coffee." They rode the elevator in comfortable silence, leaving Preston to manage the recovery. In the workshop, Katherine headed straight for the professional coffee maker, another of her thoughtful additions to the space. "You know," she said, handing him a cup, "most people would be surprised that a mechanic solved a tech company's biggest crisis." Michael took a sip, savoring the familiar taste. It was the same blend they served at Jerry's diner. Most people forget that everything, no matter how complex, comes down to basic principles. Moving parts, flow rates, friction points, doesn't matter if it's a classic car or a modern server farm. "And people?" Katherine asked softly. "Do the same principles apply?" He met her gaze, understanding the deeper question. People are more complicated. But some things stay constant: integrity, trust, the willingness to do what's right even when it's hard. Through the windows they could see the city lights coming on, the crisis passing into night. Tomorrow there would be reports to file, systems to check, questions to answer. But for now, they sat in the workshop drinking diner coffee, two people who had found something neither expected. Someone who understood that the most important repairs couldn't be measured in dollars or data. The news of Michael's unconventional solution to the server crisis spread through Morrison Technologies like wildfire. Within days, the story had taken on an almost mythical quality. The mechanic who saved the company using nothing but traditional tools and old-school knowledge. But while others talked, Katherine found herself drawn more and more to the workshop, seeking the quiet competence that had become her refuge from corporate chaos. One evening, a week after the crisis, she arrived to find Michael closing up the hood of her father's Mercedes. The workshop lights were dim, and the city sparkled beyond the windows like scattered stars. "You're here late," he observed, not looking up from his work. "So are you." She settled onto a nearby stool, kicking off her heels with a sigh of relief. "The board spent all day discussing your cooling system redesign. They're implementing it across all our data centers." Michael nodded, wiping his hands clean with the methodical care she'd come to associate with him. "It'll work better. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." Speaking of old ways, Katherine stood, moving, to a cabinet she'd had installed that morning. "I brought something I thought you might appreciate." She withdrew a bottle of aged scotch and 2 glasses. "This was my father's favorite. He used to say some conversations needed the right atmosphere." Michael hesitated, then nodded. Katherine poured 2 measures and handed him a glass. The liquid caught the workshop's low light, amber and warm. "To unconventional solutions," she offered. They drank in comfortable silence, looking out over the city. Katherine found herself studying Michael's reflection in the window. The straight posture that spoke of pride, maintained through hardship, the careful way he held the expensive crystal glass, the thoughtful expression as he savored the scotch. "You know," she said finally, "I've never brought anyone else up here after hours. This was my father's private space, and now it's yours," Michael finished. "And you're wondering if you're betraying his memory by sharing it." She turned to him, surprised by his insight. "How did you know?" "Because that's how I felt the first time I let someone else work on a car in my shop." He set down his glass. "Your father built something remarkable here. But from what I've seen, so have you. Different maybe, but no less valuable." Katherine felt something shift between them, a subtle change in the air, like the moment before an engine turns over. "I've been thinking about what you said, about basic principles." "Oh?" "Trust. Integrity. Doing what's right." She moved closer. To the Mercedes, running her hand along its polished surface. "I've spent years testing people, looking for those qualities. Never trusted anyone enough to just be myself." Michael was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he reached into his toolbox and pulled out a worn photograph. "My wife, Sarah. She died 6 years ago. Cancer. The bills took everything, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst was losing the person who knew me, really knew me." Katherine accepted the photo carefully. A pretty woman with kind eyes smiled back at her, seated in front of what must have been Michael's old shop. "I haven't shown that to anyone since I lost the shop," he said quietly. The weight of his trust settled over her. On impulse, she went to her office and returned with a small, leather-bound journal. "My father's notes. Every car, every repair, every modification he ever made. I've never let anyone else read it." They exchanged items with the gravity of sharing sacred things. Katherine opened the journal, recognizing her father's precise handwriting. "He wrote about the gull-wing here, every detail, every decision. He loved these cars," Michael said, studying an entry. "You can tell by the way he describes them, not just machines to him." "No," Katherine agreed softly. "They were his passion. Like the company." She looked up at Michael. "Like what you do." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken understanding. In the dim light of the workshop, surrounded by the machines they both loved, pretenses fell away. They were no longer CEO and employee, billionaire and mechanic, just two people who understood the value of doing things right, of maintaining integrity in a world that often forgot its importance. Katherine moved to the coffee maker, their coffee maker, and started a fresh pot. The familiar aroma filled the space, mingling. With the subtle sense of oil and leather and aged scotch, it smelled like belonging, like trust freely given and received. "I should warn you," she said, handing him a fresh cup. "The press is starting to ask questions again, about us spending time together, about your role in the company." Michael accepted the coffee, his fingers brushing hers. "Let them ask. We know the truth." "And what is the truth, Michael?" He met her gaze steadily. "That some connections can't be explained in corporate terms or tabloid headlines. They just are." Outside, the city continued its endless dance of light and shadow. But in the workshop, Katherine and Michael sat with their coffee and their trust, letting the quiet understanding between them grow in its own time, like the careful restoration of a classic engine, piece by piece, moment by moment, until something broken became whole again. The headline splashed across the New York Post was impossible to miss. "Billionaire's mechanic, from homeless to Morrison's right hand." Below it, a series of photos tracked Michael and Katherine's growing closeness, sharing coffee in the workshop, arriving together at corporate events, their quiet dinners at Jerry's diner. The article painted their relationship with innuendo and speculation, turning something genuine into tabloid fodder. Michael found the paper on his workbench one morning, deliberately placed there by someone who wanted him to see it. Around him, the usual buzz of corporate activity felt charged with whispers and sideways glances. His phone buzzed. A text from Dave. "You made the papers, brother. The shelter's going crazy with the news." Before he could respond, James Preston appeared at the workshop door, tablet in hand. The board's called an emergency meeting. They're concerned about the company's image. Katherine knew this was coming, Michael said, setting aside the newspaper. We discussed it. Did you discuss this? Preston held up his tablet, displaying a financial blog's homepage. The headline read, Morrison Technologies stock dips amid CEO's controversial relationship. Michael's hands tightened on his wrench. Over the past months, he'd proven his worth to the company a dozen times over. His redesign of the server cooling systems had saved millions. His expertise with the classic car collection had drawn positive press. But now, Mr. Sullivan, Preston's voice softened slightly. No one questions your competence, but the optics of this situation, James. Katherine's voice cut through the tension. She stood in the doorway, elegant in a charcoal suit, her expression carefully controlled. The board's waiting. As Preston left, Katherine moved to Michael's side. Don't read the papers today. Too late. He gestured to the post. They've been digging into my past, found everything. The bankruptcy, the medical bills, the years on the street. Let them dig. Katherine picked up the paper and dropped it in the recycling bin. They'll find exactly what I found. A man who never lost his integrity, no matter what he lost. The stock price will recover, just like you did. Just like I did after my father died and everyone predicted I'd run his company into the ground. She touched his arm gently. Trust me to handle this. The board meeting lasted hours. Through the glass walls, Michael could see Katherine standing her ground, her posture straight, her gestures precise and controlled. He focused on his work, letting the familiar rhythms of maintenance and repair center him. Late afternoon brought a new wave of reporters to the lobby. Security kept them at bay, but their cameras caught Michael through the workshop's windows, documenting his every move like he was some kind of corporate curiosity. His phone buzzed again, this time with messages from his old street family. Rosa, proud of you, Mr. Fix-It. Sarah, you showed them. Old Tom, always knew you were meant for better things. The support warmed him, but also highlighted the scrutiny he now faced. Every action, every decision would be analyzed through the lens of his past. The weight of it pressed down like a physical thing. The elevator dinged, and Katherine emerged from her meeting. She'd removed her suit jacket, and her carefully styled hair was slightly mussed, as if she'd been running her fingers through it in frustration. The board's concerns have been addressed, she announced, pouring them both coffee from their machine. Rather forcefully, meaning I reminded them that since your hiring, our operational costs have decreased by 15%, our server efficiency has improved by 30%, and our classic car division is becoming a significant revenue stream. She handed him his cup. I also reminded them that I own controlling interest in the company, and if they don't like how I run it, they're welcome to invest elsewhere. Michael accepted the coffee, noting that she'd prepared it exactly as he preferred. The stock price will recover when we announce the expansion of our automotive division next week. The contracts are already signed. She smiled. You're not just my mechanic anymore, Michael. You're the director of our newest and most promising department. He stared at her. You planned this. I planned for the scrutiny, yes, for the questions about your past, about our relationship. She met his gaze steadily. What I didn't plan for was finding someone I trust completely. That part just happened. Outside, camera flashes continued to light up the gathering dusk. But in the workshop, surrounded by the machines they both understood, Michael and Katherine shared a moment of quiet certainty. Let the world speculate. They knew who they were, what they had built together. Some things ran deeper than headlines and stock prices, like trust, like respect, like the understanding that grew between two people who saw past surfaces to what lay beneath. Michael composed his resignation letter at 3 in the morning, sitting in the workshop with only the city lights for company. The words came slowly, each one a weight on his conscience. Dear Katherine, I hereby tender my resignation as Director of Automotive Operations at Morrison Technologies, effective immediately. Your trust in me has been the greatest honor of my professional life, but I cannot allow my presence to continue damaging the company's reputation." He paused, looking around the space that had become more than just a workshop. Here, among the tools and machines he'd rebuilt more than cars, he'd rebuilt himself. But the morning's headlines had been brutal. Morrison's stock continues to fall. Board questions. CEO's judgment. The financial analysts were beginning to question Katherine's leadership, suggesting that her emotional involvement with an employee was clouding her business decisions. The letter felt inadequate, unable to convey everything he needed to say. How do you thank someone for giving you back your dignity? How do you explain walking away from the best thing in your life because staying would hurt them? A soft ding announced the elevator's arrival. Katherine stepped out, still in her evening dress from the charity gala she'd attended. She took one look at Michael's face and the paper in his hands, and her expression hardened. "Don't you dare!" "Katherine!" "No!" She crossed the workshop in quick strides, snatching the letter from his hands. Her eyes scanned it briefly before she tore it in half. "You don't get to do this, not you. The company's suffering. Your reputation is mine to worry about." She turned to face him fully, the torn letter falling to the floor between them. "Do you know what my father told me before he died? He said, 'Katie, people will always question your decisions. Make sure the ones you fight for are worth it.'" Michael stood, needing to move, to think. This isn't just about us anymore. The board, the shareholders. "Let me tell you about the board meeting you missed today." Katherine perched on his workbench, her elegant gala dress incongruous against the tools and oil stains. 3 major investment firms called. They want to partner with our automotive division. Your reputation for excellence, for authenticity, is exactly what they're looking for. He stopped pacing. "What? The world is changing, Michael. People are tired of corporate polish and empty promises. They want real expertise, genuine passion." She smiled slightly. "They want someone who fixes things because they should be fixed, not because it's profitable. But the stock price is recovering, has been since we announced the expansion." She stood, moving to the gullwing they'd restored together. "You know what makes a classic car valuable? Its story, the journey it's taken, the challenges it's overcome. The same is true for people." Michael followed her to the car, their reflections ghostly in its polished surface. "I won't be the reason you lose everything you've built." "Then stay." Katherine's voice was soft but firm. "Because everything I'm building now, I'm building with you." She reached into her evening bag and withdrew a folded newspaper. "Read this." It was the Wall Street Journal's evening edition. The headline read, "Morrison Technologies redefines corporate leadership, how authenticity became the new currency of success." The article praised Katherine's innovative approach to talent acquisition and corporate culture, citing their partnership as an example of how companies could bridge social divides while maintaining excellence. "They're starting to understand," Katherine said. "What we're doing here isn't just about cars or companies. It's about proving that true value isn't found in where someone comes from, but in who they are." Michael ran his hand along the gullwing's hood, feeling the perfect smoothness they'd achieved together. "I still have the first wrench I ever owned," he said quietly. "It's rusted now, practically worthless. But I keep it because it reminds me of where I started, what I learned along the way. Like this car reminds me of my father." Katherine touched the Mercedes star emblem. "Some things are worth more than their market value." The torn resignation letter lay forgotten on the floor as the night deepened around them. Through the windows, the city lights seemed to blur and soften, creating a private world in the workshop. Michael thought about Dave, Rosa, and the others from his street family, how they'd celebrated his success, not because of the money or position, but because they'd always seen his true worth. "Partners?" Katherine asked, echoing their conversation. From months ago, Michael nodded, understanding now that running away wouldn't protect either of them. It would only prove their critics right. Partners, he agreed, whatever comes next. And there in the workshop, surrounded by the machines they'd brought back to life together, they faced the future not as CEO and mechanic, not as billionaire and former homeless man, but as two people who had found in each other something rare and true, the courage to be exactly who they were. The Morrison Technologies annual shareholders meeting wasn't where Michael had expected to find his voice. Yet here he stood beside Katherine on the auditorium stage, facing hundreds of investors, board members, and media representatives. His new suit felt strange after months in workshop clothes, but Katherine had insisted today wasn't about fixing engines, but about fixing perceptions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Katherine began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the space. "A year ago, I made a decision that many of you questioned. I hired a man based not on his current circumstances, but on his character and expertise. Today, I want him to tell you why that decision wasn't just right for him. It was right for all of us." She stepped back, giving Michael the podium. Silence in the auditorium felt heavy, expectant. He looked down at his prepared speech, then set it aside. If they wanted authenticity, he'd give them the unvarnished truth. 6 years ago, I owned a successful auto repair shop, he began. I had certifications on my wall, respect in my community, and pride in my work. Then my wife got sick. The insurance company denied our claims. The medical bills took everything, our savings, our home, my shop. But they couldn't take my knowledge, my skills, or my integrity. The audience stirred, uncomfortable with this direct confrontation of privilege and poverty. Michael continued, his voice steady. "When Ms. Morrison found me, I was living on the streets, but I still carried my tools, still helped people when I could. Not for money or recognition, but because that's who I am. She saw past my circumstances to my capabilities. Now I'm asking you to do the same, not just for me, but for others like me." Katherine stepped forward, seamlessly taking over. "Today, we're announcing the Morrison Second Chances Initiative. We're partnering with local shelters and technical schools to identify skilled individuals who've fallen on hard times. We'll provide training, employment, and support to help them rebuild their lives through meaningful work." On the screens behind them, images appeared. The workshop transformed into a training center, plans for expanded facilities, partnerships with automotive manufacturers. Michael's design for a comprehensive education program that combined traditional mechanics with modern technology. "The first facility opens next month," Katherine announced. "Under Mr. Sullivan's direction, we'll be offering certified training programs in automotive restoration, mechanical engineering, and systems maintenance. Every graduate will be guaranteed job placement, either within Morrison Technologies or with one of our partner companies." The room erupted with questions. Michael watched as Katherine handled them with practiced ease, her responses emphasizing the program's practical benefits: reduced training costs, skilled workforce development, positive community impact. But beneath her corporate language, he heard the deeper message: everyone deserves a chance to rebuild. "Mr. Sullivan," a reporter called out, "how do you respond to suggestions that your relationship with Ms. Morrison is inappropriate given your positions?" Before Katherine could intervene, Michael stepped to the microphone. "When I was on the streets, I learned that true character shows in how people treat you when they think you have nothing to offer. Ms. Morrison offered me respect before she knew my capabilities, dignity before she knew my potential. Our professional relationship works because it's built on mutual respect and shared values. Anyone suggesting otherwise is missing the point of everything we're trying to achieve here." A quiet ripple of approval moved through the audience. Katherine's slight smile told him he'd said exactly the right thing. She returned to the podium for the final announcement. "The board has unanimously approved the expansion of our automotive division, with Mr. Sullivan as executive director. Additionally, we're establishing a foundation to support similar initiatives across other industries, because talent and integrity can be found anywhere, if we just have the courage to look. After the presentation, as they made their way through, congratulations and press questions, Michael felt a tug on his sleeve. A young woman in hotel maintenance uniforms stood nervously clutching a newspaper clipping about their program. "I was a mechanical engineer in my country," she said softly, "but here my credentials aren't recognized. Could your program come to the workshop tomorrow morning?" Michael replied, pulling out one of his new business cards. "We'll start with an assessment of your skills." Katherine, overhearing, added her own card. "Ask for either of us. This is exactly why we created this program." Later, in the sanctuary of their workshop, Michael found Katherine staring at the Gullwing, the car that had started everything. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. "I was thinking about legacy," she replied. "Dad left me a company, but together we're building something more important, a way to see value in people others have overlooked." Michael nodded, understanding completely. Sometimes the most important repairs weren't to machines at all, but to the broken systems that kept good people down. Today, they'd taken the first step toward fixing something far bigger than engines. The transformed workspace hummed with activity. Where once there had been only Michael and his tools, now a dozen workstations filled the expanded floor, each occupied by a student learning the art of automotive restoration. The gleaming Gullwing remained in its place of honor, but it had been joined by other classics in various stages of repair, each one a teaching tool, a chance for redemption. Michael moved between the stations, pausing to observe, guide, and encourage. At one bench, Rosa, the same Rosa who'd once lived under the Harrison Street Bridge, was meticulously rebuilding a carburetor. Her weathered hands had found new purpose in the precise work, her natural patience proving perfect for the delicate adjustments required. "Remember," he said, watching her work, "these older systems tell you what they need if you listen carefully." "Enough," she nodded, not looking up from her task. "Like people, Mr. Fix-It, like people." At another station, the young engineer they'd met after the shareholders' meeting, Amara, was teaching a group of students the relationship between classical mechanics and modern computer systems. Her expertise, once dismissed due to her immigration status, now formed a crucial bridge between old and new technologies. Katherine appeared beside him, having shed her corporate suit for more practical attire. She'd taken to spending afternoons in the workshop, learning alongside their students. Today, she carried a stack of certificates, the first graduation documents for their program. "The partner companies are fighting over our first class of graduates," she said, pride evident in her voice. "Apparently, word has gotten out about the quality of our training." Michael watched Dave demonstrate wheelchair repair techniques to a group of veterans, a specialized program they'd developed after realizing how many of their potential students faced mobility challenges. "It's not just the training," he replied. "It's the perspective they bring. They understand the value of second chances." A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. James Preston was leading a group of international executives through the space. The visitors' initial skepticism visibly shifted as they observed the professional atmosphere, the quality of work being produced, the obvious expertise being shared. "Mr. Sullivan," Preston called out, "would you mind showing our guests the restoration project?" Michael led the group to a partially restored Jaguar E-Type. He explained their teaching methodology, the combination of traditional craftsmanship and modern techniques, the emphasis on understanding fundamental principles. The executives listened with growing interest, particularly when he detailed how their graduates were revolutionizing maintenance procedures in their partner companies. "The skills were always there," he explained, gesturing to his students. "They just needed someone to look past circumstances to see capability." One of the executives, a German automotive manufacturer, nodded thoughtfully. "We have similar issues in Europe, skilled workers displaced by economic changes, refugees with valuable experience but no formal credentials. Perhaps we could discuss expanding your program internationally? Katherine stepped forward smoothly. We'd be happy to share our model. In fact, as she led the executives away to discuss details, Michael found himself beside the gullwing that had started everything. Sarah, his young runaway friend from the streets, was carefully cleaning its chromework, her reflection showing a confidence that hadn't existed months ago. Hard to believe it all started with this car, she said, stepping back to admire her work. Sometimes the right tool at the right moment can change everything, Michael replied, remembering that night in the rain. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching on the certificates Katherine had left on his workbench. Each one represented a life changed, a skill renewed, a dignity restored. But more than that, they represented a new way of seeing. Value in people, in opportunities, in the connections that could be built between different worlds. A noise made him turn. Old Tom had arrived for his afternoon class, pushing the shopping cart Michael had once fixed. But now the cart was filled with tools instead of cans, its wheels recently oiled, its purpose transformed like its owner. "Ready for today's lesson, boss?" Tom asked, his voice carrying the pride of someone who had found his place. Michael nodded, reaching for his toolbox, the same one he'd carried through his darkest days. "Today," he said, "we're going to learn about transformation, about how something that seems broken can become something extraordinary if you just have the right eyes to see its potential." 1 year to the day after their first meeting, Katherine's Mercedes sat once again on that quiet Manhattan street corner. The evening light was similar, the air holding the same hint of approaching winter. But everything else had changed. Michael knelt beside the car, his original toolbox open on the pavement. The tools inside were the same ones he'd used that night, each one maintained with the same care, each carrying a year's worth of additional stories. Katherine stood nearby, wearing the simple grey dress she'd worn during their first encounter. "Feels strange," he said, running his hand along the Mercedes' polished hood. "Being back here. Good strange or bad strange? Just strange." He straightened up, taking in their surroundings. The street looked smaller somehow, less threatening than it had during his years of homelessness. "I used to sleep in that doorway. Over there, had a perfect view of this corner." Katherine moved closer, her heels clicking on the pavement just as they had that first night. "Is that why you stopped when you saw the car?" "No." He smiled slightly. "I stopped because someone had deliberately damaged a beautiful machine. Couldn't walk away from that, even then." The sound of approaching footsteps made them turn. Dave wheeled himself around the corner, followed by Rosa, Sarah, and old Tom. They were all dressed nicely, graduates and instructors now in the program they'd helped build. "Thought we'd find you here," Dave said, his wheelchair now equipped. With modifications he'd designed himself. Wouldn't miss the anniversary. Rosa carried a thermal container that smelled of Jerry's Diner coffee. Sarah had her portable radio, restored now, but still keeping her connected to the world. Old Tom's cart had become a mobile tool chest for the outdoor repair classes he taught. "We brought something else," Sarah said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a framed certificate, the first one issued by their program. Its gold seal, catching the evening light, just as Michael's old certifications had done. "From this corner," Katherine read from the small plaque they'd added below the certificate, "a revolution in second chances began. We're putting it in the new training center's lobby." Michael took the frame, its weight feeling significant. In his hands, he remembered standing on this corner a year ago, hungry and cold, but still holding on to his dignity, his skills, his determination to do things right. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about what makes some repairs work and others fail." "And?" Katherine prompted, knowing his tendency to find deeper meaning in mechanical principles. "It's not just about fixing what's broken, it's about understanding why it broke, making sure it's stronger in those places." He gestured to their gathered friends. "That's what we've really been doing this past year." The evening had deepened around them. the city lights creating a familiar glow. From this corner, they could see the Morrison Technologies building rising into the darkening sky, its windows gleaming. The top floors, now home to their expanding program, were lit up with activity even at this hour. "I have something for you," Katherine said suddenly. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small box. Inside was a key, not to a car or a building, but something more personal. "Your father's toolbox." Michael recognized it immediately. "Katherine, I can't." "He would have wanted you to have it," she insisted, "not because you need the tools, but because you understand what they represent. The responsibility of fixing things, of making them better than they were." He accepted the key, understanding the trust it represented. Around them, their friends shared knowing looks. They'd seen this connection grow from professional respect to something deeper, something built on shared values and mutual understanding. A car backfired nearby, making them all jump. Then Sarah laughed, breaking the tension. "Remember when that sound meant looking for cover? Now we can diagnose the engine problem from here." They all chuckled, acknowledging how far they'd come. Old Tom opened his cart, revealing a small celebration he'd prepared. Cups for the coffee, some pastries from the diner, even a candle to mark the occasion. As they shared their impromptu anniversary party on the corner where everything began, Michael caught Katherine's eye. She nodded slightly, understanding what he was thinking. Sometimes the strongest repairs weren't to machines at all, but to the connections between people. Connections that could bridge any gap, heal any break, if given the chance. The morning sun streamed through the workshop windows, catching on the framed photo that now held pride of place on Michael's workbench. It showed a simple scene, Katherine and Michael at Jerry's diner, coffee cups between them, caught in a moment of shared laughter. Doris had taken it during one of their regular visits, capturing the genuine connection that had grown between them. Today was graduation day for their second class of students, but Michael had arrived early, drawn to the quiet of the morning workshop. He moved through his routine, checking each station, ensuring everything was perfect for the ceremony. His father-in-law's toolbox, he still thought of it that way, sat beside his own, both representing different chapters of the same story. The elevator dinged, and Katherine stepped out. She'd forsaken her usual business attire for an outfit more suited to the workshop. Practical clothes that spoke of their shared commitment to hands-on leadership. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, crossing to the coffee maker. Still the same model from Jerry's. "Nervous about the speech?" "A bit." He accepted the cup she offered. "Never thought I'd be addressing the United Nations about workplace innovation." "Well, they did just adopt our program as a global model for economic rehabilitation." She smiled, pride evident in her expression. "Though I suspect they're more interested in the 98% employment rate than your philosophy about proper talk settings." Michael chuckled, but his eyes were drawn to the wall of success stories, photographs of their graduates, news clippings, letters of thanks. Dave's wheelchair repair program had expanded to 3 states. Rosa was leading their senior training initiative. Sarah had just opened their first youth outreach center. "Sometimes I wonder," he said quietly, "what would have happened if you hadn't deliberately damaged that Mercedes that night." Katherine set down her cup. "I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to fix it." She moved to the Gull Wing, their first project together. "You know, the board finally stopped questioning my judgment about 6 months ago." "About the program?" "About us." She turned to face him. "They figured out that some partnerships work because they're meant to, not because they make sense on paper." The morning light strengthened, bringing the workshop fully to life. Soon the space would fill with guests, graduates, and media. Their story had become more than just personal. It was a symbol of possibility, of the value that could be found in unexpected places. A knock at the door interrupted them. James Preston entered, carrying a newspaper. "You might want to see this," he said, handing it to Katherine. The headline read, "Morrison Sullivan Initiative Receives Nobel Peace Prize Nomination for Economic Justice Work." Below was a picture of their training center, with Michael teaching a group of students while Katherine worked alongside them.